Perfect. That'll be great for the talk. No.
So let's get started. Thanks everyone for coming. We're just so delighted to actually be initiating now our second annual Gesell Lecture. And it's a real pleasure to have Dr. Megan Gunner as our second lecturer. It's also a pleasure to have Dr. Steve Sumi, who was our first lecturer, back with us this week as well. Steve's in the back, right? So let me just tell you just a tiny bit about Arnold Gesell, for those of you who don't know. That Arnold Gesell was actually the first chair of the Child Study Center. He was actually indeed the founder of the Child Study Center in 1911. And he worked as a pediatrician and a psychologist. His work was central to the understanding of early child development, and he used innovative methods for his time for mapping out how children developed across from infancy into adolescence and adulthood. Indeed, many of the Gesell scales still are the foundation of many of the developmental measures that we use. Gesell shaped how people think about a lot about parenting and raising children, and much of his early studies were actually done with cohorts of the children of Yale professors. So you can actually question how much of a standardized sample that was indeed. But indeed, actually, the study of human development is a central preoccupation both in medicine and the liberal arts. But there are few opportunities for all of us really to come together to think through the modern developments in child development and how we really think about now the interface of the brain, behavior, genetics. And how we think about how modern child development contributes to the transformation of adults into adult health. So that's the purpose of the annual Gesell Lecture, is to try to bring contemporary ideals of children's development into the forefront and to encourage all of us to work together, and not just the Child Study Center, but across the university. So we're so honored to have Dr. Megan Gunner as our second annual lecturer. Dr. Gunner's work actually exemplifies the careful developmental scholarship represented by Arnold Gesell and his colleagues. Dr. Gunner is a Regents Professor and Distinguished McKnight University Professor of Child Development at the Institute of Child Development and the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. Her work addresses those questions that are so central to the field of child mental health. That is, how early experiences, especially in caring relationships, influence children's developmental trajectories and their lifelong course as the basis for adult health. She spent her career studying how infants and young children respond to potentially stressful situations, and she's documented the especially powerful role of relationships, early on caring relationships, in regulating the stress physiology of young children. Much of her work in the last decade has been devoted to understanding the impact of early deprivation and neglect on children's development, something that is so much a part of the clinical work here in the Child Study Center. She directs a National Institute of Mental Health Center on early experience, stress, and neurobehavioral development that includes researchers from 7 universities. At the University of Minnesota, she's the director of the Institute of Child Development and the associate director of the Center for Neurobehavioral Development. Nationally, she's a member of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, a place where she and I had much chance to interact with one another. She's also received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the American Psychological Association, the G. Stanley Hall Award for the Distinguished Contributions to Developmental Psychology, and the Society for Child Development, its Distinguished Contributions to Research on Child Development. I would just also say that Dr. Gunner is a very caring and generative mentor. So many developmental scholars across this country and indeed across the world can trace their early career to her mentorship. And through them, she has had a great impact on our field, even beyond the impact that her science itself has had. You'll hear that she cares deeply for children and families, cares deeply about how we get our science out to make a direct impact sooner than it often happens, and thus is very involved in policy. You'll hear that as well. And working very hard to find ways to more felicitously, efficiently inform clinical work with children. I feel personally actually very, very grateful for all the time we've spent together, Megan, and for the opportunity to have you come to New Haven and to introduce you to the Child Study Center community and to have you be our second Gesell Lecturer. Welcome to the Child Study Center.
That was a really lovely introduction. A lot of the things she says you'll only hear if you keep talking with me beyond this talk, because I can't do all of that in one talk. I am really honored to be here, to be the second Gesell Lecturer, to follow in the footsteps of my dear friend Steve Sumi. I've done that many times. I learned that you show pretty kid pictures because he's going to show cute monkey pictures, and actually beat him out because cute kids are monkeys, but that's okay. So today, they've got me doing 3 lectures here, so if you want to be a groupie and follow me through them all. Today I'm going to talk about kids adopted from orphanages internationally, and I'm going to focus on behavioral issues that are really the signatures of that experience. Attachment issues, though not actually, but you'll get there. Trust and executive function. And then on tomorrow, I guess, I'm talking about early experiences and the possible, these kind of kids, but looking at the biology of stress and whether it's influenced by that those early experiences and whether there's an opportunity to recalibrate. And then Thursday, I'll be talking about what I'm working on. Friday, whatever, one of these days, I'm going to be talking about social buffering and the work that I'm doing on the development of that process. So today we're focusing on behavior. But all of this work that we do, all of this work that I do, is motivated deeply by an interest in whether and how early experiences affect functioning throughout life. So what are the links between this baby and this baby when he will be an aged individual? How do we understand that process? And I have been lucky enough to be part of a number of groups that have developed concepts that we are now using that really help us begin to think, at least metaphorically, about how this happens. The Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, the CFAR group, way back when Steve was a member and I wasn't yet a member, wrote a book about the biological embedding and coined that concept of biological embedding of early experiences that allow those experiences then to carry forward and influence health later on. The National Scientific Council, as you see there, this diagram is one of the things that we worked on and published in JAMA, although all of us were authors on it. And it was explaining how adverse, where's my little, no, I don't want that. I don't want that either. I just want my little pretty thing. Okay, there we go. There we go. Where's the cursor? Ah, there it is. Thank you. How early experiences of either sort of stress that's of a toxic nature, environmental exposures, malnutrition, how that gets embedded biologically to be able to alter physiology, which amplifies the cumulative burden of adversity throughout life and leads ultimately in adulthood to disease, or even in adolescence to disease, health problems, and ultimately early death. I mean, it's the model, trying to help pediatricians understand that this is part of physical health and not just mental and emotional health. And as Linda mentioned, I have directed, it's sunsetted, unfortunately, this Early Experience Stress and Neurobehavioral Development Center, where we were working on putting flesh on the bones of what that biological embedding was all about, what mechanisms might be involved. The big question for me throughout my career is, how do you go about studying the impact of early experiences? Now, in the animal models that we have, and certainly that we had in 2000 when I was starting this, the best evidence we had was, what's the effect of early deprivation? Removing caregiving figures, and then what happens to the animal's development. We now have animal models like this that are better for looking at maltreatment and abuse. Tanya Roth's work has a model that is useful there. But most of our models and most of our understanding, when we get down to the molecular level, is about deprivation, neglect, lack of what should be there, right? And that's also true in our non-human primate models, except for ones where we see spontaneous maltreatment on the part of the mother. But much of our non-human primate models also were models of deprivation, neglect, lack of things that should be there. So when I came to this work and I said, man, I want to be able to use all of this wonderful research on animals to inform me about the questions and the possible mechanisms that we would look at with early experiences in humans, I said, where should I look? I did do some work with Dante Cicchetti. I got my feet wet in maltreatment. I said, Dante, you can deal with this, because this is really complicated, because it's not just what happens early, it keeps happening. You all know that. But I wanted to know what happens early. So that led me to think, well, there is a model out there, and it was opening up in the 1989-90, and that was the model of kids being raised in orphanages and then being adopted into homes where they had some of the best that the world had to offer. And it would allow you to look at what the impact of early is when it's followed by what should be the best to help the kids recover. Now, kids raised in orphanages have been catnip for developmental psychologists for ages, right? And this orphanage adoption model is powerful. So you go from this, where there's really no one who is your caregiver, that is a one-on-one. People who have studied this context say so many times there's only like 5 minutes of on-fast loss back and forth a day on average. You're cared for by multiple caregivers. They're on their own schedules. The schedules are organized around the needs of the caregivers, not the kids. You may see 25 different caregivers a week. You go from that to this, where you are the apple of these people's eyes. And these people have had to take a test to be able to adopt, right? Not that it's a real stringent test, but it's a test, more so than just having kids. And they've had to mobilize resources for a long period of time to be able to get this child to their home. So it's a huge shift, and it's one of the most powerful interventions that we know of. If we could do this for kids, if we could create families who are as strong as these families for kids who are coming up in other adversities, we'd be really happy. I'm not talking about taking them away and giving them into their families, but if we could help their family be this powerful, it would be terrific. as I said, it's been catnip for us for a long time. The early period, some of which was done here with Province and Lipton, very important work on orphanage development. Spitz, Goldfarb, Barbara Tizard, Mike Rudder. I mean, that's what led us to get rid of orphanages and realize that babies don't grow well if they're not in a relationship with one or a few adults. And we developed foster care. The current period began in December of 1989 with Ceausescu and his wife being shot. The curtain coming down in Romania. It fell very soon after that in other areas. And people seeing all of these children warehoused in orphanages as part of Ceausescu's system of developing more workers and going to Romania, collecting their baby, bringing them home, then beginning to buy babies, and then the whole system shut down. And in those children that came out in the first 2 years after that, Mike Rudder has been studying for a number of years as part of the English and Romanian adoption study, where he found a randomized stratified sample of those kids in the United Kingdom. The ones adopted early, birth to 6 months, were equivalent. He compared them to kids adopted in the UK. They were a comparison group. And then the over 6 months were the PI group, and I'll be talking to you about data from that study periodically in my talk. The Bucharest Early Intervention Study has been done by Charlie Zena, someone you probably know well, and Chuck Nelson and Nathan Fox. And this was done with MacArthur money, where they went into orphanages in Bucharest in around 2000. They did baseline assessments, and then they randomly assigned to go into foster care homes that were supported and designed and trained by Charlie Zena and his crew. So this was beautiful foster care. They could do this because there was no foster care in Romania at that time. And so they had a group of kids in Romania of the same age. They had the kids who stayed in care as usual, who then quickly went into foster care once they started developing it in Romania, and the ones that they put in their foster care. So I'll be mentioning both of those studies. Okay. I decided when I started into this that, first of all, kids were not just coming from Romania. In fact, the smallest group of kids adopted have been the Romanian kids. They're coming from China and Russia and Latin America. They're coming from all over the world. America went through a process of being a huge social experiment in whether you could take kids from deprivation, give them homes, and everything would be slick. During that period of time, you can see that the kids were being adopted on average below 2 years of age. Most of them were girls. The peak of this was in 2005. And then things have really slowed down. Now there's hardly anyone being adopted internationally. So if you get excited about this work, do not plan to study kids coming in from orphanages. You will not have any subjects, or not many. But this was the picture in the United States. And Minnesota, my state, is one of the biggest per capita adoption states. So I decided that I'd let them do their longitudinal studies. And since we didn't know what we were really looking at, I would develop a registry of kids who were adopted internationally that I could draw from. And in 2001, we surveyed all of the kids in Minnesota who'd been adopted internationally from 1990 to 98. That was 4,000 kids, and we got close to 4,000 responses back. We created a registry. We continue to add to that. I've got over 7,000 kids on that registry, many of whom are from orphanages, but some are from foster care overseas. That's my comparison group often, one of them. They come from multiple countries, and I've been pulling in and creating samples for different studies. From that, I do have a longitudinal study now I'll be talking to you about, but I wanted to see the landscape before I committed myself to what I wanted to understand. So you'll be hearing about all of this. Themes for today, we're going to talk about attachment and disorders of social engagement. We're talking about attention problems, which are really executive functions and problems with prefrontal cortex development, and poor peer relations, including lack of trust. Now, you may notice that what's not on this is I'm not talking about depression, anxiety disorders, and conduct problems. And that's because those aren't the big signals. It's not that these kids don't have some degree of elevation in problems with externalizing issues, but Mike Rudder, studying the worst of the worst, the kids who came out of Ceausescu's era, has been able to show that, boy, the percentages that have clinical level disorders are generally low, both for emotional problems and for conduct problems, until you begin to get to adolescence. And then in terms of emotional problems, it's really not until adulthood. So the red there are the kids adopted 6 months and beyond. The blue are the ones adopted under 6 months from Romania, and the others are the domestic adopted kids. And you can see it's elevated, but it's not like the huge signal here until you get to being an adult. And Mike and I both argue that it's the accumulation of these other problems that are tripping them into some of these issues, or at least we think so. So these are what we're going to go after. Let's start with attachment. Okay. You go from this to, you go from this to having a family, but what do you look like when you're in the institution? And for this, I turned to the work from the Bucharest Project, where they were doing strange situations as part of their baseline assessment, and they were trying to classify them as secure, insecure, all that. But the first question really was, are they even attached to their favorite caregiver? So Charlie Zena and Betty Carlson developed a scale that would allow them to look at behavior in the strange situation and decide where they were on developing a specific attachment. And what they found in the orphanages is that only a very small fraction could you talk about as being attached and able to classify as ADC. You had attachment with anomalies for about 30% of them, some preference, but pretty passive. And then the rest of them, there was very little evidence that they had actually formed a specific attachment. So you can't look at security, right? And insecurity, you just have to look at have they formed an attachment. I wanted to know what happens when they get families. How long does it take? Or are they able to form those specific attachments? So working with Betty, who's at the Institute of Child Development, we did a study, which we're still doing, called our Transition into the Family Study, or TIFS for short. Kids were adopted from orphanages 16 to 36 months of age. They come from around the world. Nearly all had been institutionalized their whole lives prior to getting there. But this is pretty late, 1.5 to 3 years, right? We did a modified strange situation when they were 1 to 3 months and 8 to 9 months after adoption. We assessed the attachment formation. Betty coded these, so I trust these. Here's what we saw. At roughly 2 months after, we didn't see any 1s and 2s. We saw a few 3s, like preference, but passive. Anomalies, clear. 2 months in. By 8 to 10 months, all of them had formed, all but a few had formed a specific attachment where you could classify them clearly as having been attached. We were stunned by these data. I thought it would take more than this. It's sort of hard to beat forming an attachment out of a child. Oh, but they're going to be all messed up attachments, right? They're going to be all insecure. Well, Betty classified those as well. And what we see, our comparison group are non-adopted kids born and raised in their families of origin. And we do see more disorganized in the red. But she was thinking that about 68 to 70% of them, now they're older, right, were looking like they were really using their parents as a secure base. Now that may seem really odd to you guys who maybe had dipped into the literature a few years ago, because when the original stuff from Mike Rutter's group came out, it was really all about these disinhibited attachment disorders being really prevalent in these kids. At 4 years of age, they were able to test all but the ones who had been adopted after 24 months, and they were seeing a fair amount of this disinhibited attachment disorder. When they got the kids who had been adopted later, it was up to over 30% of them had an attachment disorder. But do they? And if you've been following all of this literature and you know of the change in the DSM, there is no more in the DSM a disinhibited attachment disorder category. It's become this disorder of social engagement, because the behavior that you see that gets them classified that way is mostly about how they respond to strangers. It's not about how they're responding to their parent. So they're indiscriminately friendly, which is freaky, right? Kid you've never seen comes up and wants to crawl in your lap. It's like, don't know. And you see this even in kids who would be classified as securely attached. The etiology is lack of a consistent attachment figure during this time when attachment is formed. But it persists long after you get this figure that you can form an attachment around, right? So this has been a massive change in our thinking. Now, if you're showing this behavior and it's with the parent you've been living with from birth, it may well be a detachment disorder. But if you're showing this behavior, you had all of this, and now you're with someone you can actually use, it may not be. So this is great news for all these parents. No, your kid is attached to you. And they've got this other issue, which is predictive of problems. That's true. Okay. So we decided we would follow and try to see if we could, how early could we identify kids that were on the pathway to having a disorder of social engagement, again in the TIFS study. We saw them 4 times in the first 2 years, and each time we did sort of in the strange situation, we did an expanded version of the stranger interaction that we were doing at the beginning of that. We observed them, we coded their behavior, and then at 5 to 5.5 years of age, we did a disorder of social engagement interview. It was an adaptation of Charlie Zena's disorder of attachment interview, but it focused on things that would lead you to have the DSED classification. We factor analyzed because what I wanted to know is what distinguished kids out of orphanages from non-adopted kids, and what's the developmental pathway of this. We ended up with 2 factors. One of them was touching strangers, leaning on, sitting on, cuddling, hugging strangers. And as you see, from the very first time we saw them, non-adopted kids do not do this, right? It's a stranger. I might be very friendly. I might do this nonstop. I might smile and talk and everything, but I ain't touching you, right? But I get a lot of touching out of the PI kids. And then over time, they seem to come down on that, but what they were going up on was all the non-physical, okay? Now, what predicted who was going to have a disorder? What we found is at 5.5, 21% of the kids, and that's a fair amount, would have been classified with a disorder of social engagement. They were the ones who had spent more of their lives in institutions and had poor social care according to the parents' description of what they saw in the institution and our social worker rating from that description. You can see, whoops, and we combined physical and social to be able to do this because it did come together later on, and what you're seeing at time 1, I couldn't have told. 2 months in, can't tell. But there is this big increase in the expression of indiscriminate friendliness between time 1 and time 2 for the kids to go on to that. And you're going, why is it an increase? Well, it's their second time coming into the laboratory. It's more familiar. It's not the same stranger, but they've been here before. So they seem, that familiarity seems to have really released this kind of behavior. So by 8, 10 months, if the kid's familiar, you might be able to tell which ones are potentially moving on to something you want to work on and intervene with. Okay? So if this disorder of social engagement isn't really related to attachment, it's only in its etiology, but not concurrently, what is it related to? That was our question. And of course, Mike Rudder got there before me. It's always depressing to do work in the area he's done work in, because nothing you think is novel, right? So way back in 2004, he also loved these, Roy Rudder and Pickles. Anyway, they published this paper that was based actually on the work, I believe, of Barbara Tizard. I think that was these kids that they were able to identify so long ago who they had followed into school, and they did a reanalysis, I believe, and actually, Andrea, you can find out if I'm lying about this. You're nodding, I'm not lying? Or I am lying? You're not lying. Thank you. Because there were not kids in the UK that were growing up in institutions later than that. And they tracked them into school, and they noticed what was very interesting to them, that their overactivity and lack of selective social relationships, that's the disinhibited attachment disorder, which is really indiscriminate friendliness, seem to be related. So we took that data and we said, I wonder if we see something like that as well. And we took tasks that B.J. Casey developed to look at inhibitory control in cognitive, beautiful tasks, and parent report of not executive function, effortful control. And we studied kids at 6 who were either adopted from orphanages, adopted from foster care overseas, or born and raised in their Minnesota families. And what we saw is that both poor inhibitory control and indiscriminate friendliness, the patterns were very similar. So the non-adopted kids, really low on these things. PIs, post-institutionalized, very high. Foster care, in between, depending on really how rough they had had it before they got adopted. So this is not just about orphanages, is an important thing my data keeps showing. It's about adverse early care and disruptions in care. And more so, that if we correlate these, the correlation is about 0.43 between what we were getting for disinhibited social engagement, which is what we were calling it then, and inhibitory control. So Rudder was right. There is a link between these two things. And they also saw this in their English and Romanian adoption study. Recently, in the TIFS study, where we did the interview and got the measure of disinhibited social engagement disorder, we also had parents reporting using the MacArthur Health and Behavior Questionnaire on peer relations, internalizing, externalizing, and ADHD. And what you see is that our post-institutionalized kids who scored positive for this disorder were the ones who had the problems with ADHD, externalizing, really expressing ADHD issues there, internalizing, not so much, and problems in peer relations, which I will come back to, because I think we're looking at a trifecta. Here is why I put these three together. There was a method in my madness. We've also, of course, I wouldn't be doing this. You have to collect cortisol if you're in my lab. Otherwise, there's no reason to be in my lab. So as part of this whole study, and you'll hear more about this tomorrow, right? We have been looking at activity of the HPA axis. And what we have seen is hypocortisolism as the signature out of this. So come tomorrow and find out that rats are the wrong model. And the question is, what does it predict? Does it matter? And what does it matter for? And here what we're seeing is we saw these TIF kids in kindergarten as well. I have teacher report of internalizing, externalizing, and ADHD. I have a hypocortisolism score that I developed in the first 2 years after they were adopted. I have, and it has flatter slope across the day, lower morning value, and less reaction to a stressor in it. The level when they come to the lab wasn't. That's that anticipatory whatever, and it's out to lunch there. But early adversity is related to hypocortisolism, and child sex, and hypocortisolism are related to externalizing and ADHD. So even controlling for child sex, we're seeing a hypocortisolism prediction. So we may have a quadrilateral, right, that involves all of these capacities, or all of these measures. So I think what I've shown you is that, gee, there's something about attention problems, and now I'm going to argue it ain't attention problems, it's executive function problems, more broadly, that these kids are struggling with. And we have done a bunch of studies of this. One of our more recent studies, again with the TIFS kid, where a year after they got here, we did a whole series of executive function tasks. Stephanie Carlson, who is like the whiz at early kid executive function, worked with us. And we administered her version of the dimensional change card sort task, spin the pots, which that's cognitive flexibility. Spin the pots, spatial working memory, cool game, that I won't describe it, and delay of gratification. They factored together. We don't have a sex difference a year after adoption if you were adopted 1.5 to 3 years of age. And what you can see is the kids who come from orphanages are doing loads worse than the non-adopted kids. So struggle executive functions more generally than just attention. One of the things that people have been interested in is if they're showing this, does it show the same physiologic signature that problems with inhibitory control would? And the answer is yeah. This is a study, different study, 9 to 11-year-old kids. This was done by Michelle Lohman. We had help from Chuck Nelson on this one. We gave the kids a flanker and a go-no-go task. Everybody cool with flanker and go-no-to-go? Right, they're inhibitory control tasks, 2 kinds. What you're seeing is my non-adopted kids are percent correct, are doing really good. My foster care kids aren't doing too bad. My kids struggling with this are my post-institutionalized kids. They're 9 to 11 years old. They were adopted on average at 2. They've been living 7 years under the best circumstances typically the world has to offer kids. If I look at the peak amplitude, For the N2, which is an early attention signature, they're showing less of that. And the ERN, which is an error-related negativity, which my friend Nathan Fox calls the OSH response. These are generated by the anterior cingulate, and they're showing less of that kind of signal, which would catch them if they're making errors. So less grabbing of the rest of your brain to say, ooh, pay attention. Does that make sense? So we're seeing the same signature you'd expect. Some of you know that if you do EEG power spectrum analyses of kids developing, one of the things you see with development is a decrease in lower frequency amplitudes and an increase in higher frequency amplitudes as the brain myelinates, right? That's a typical progression. If you look at the literature on ADHD, there's some evidence of an increase in theta, like lower frequency, like their brain's not maturing as rapidly, especially in the prefrontal areas. And we see a delay in development of this signature in kids coming from orphanages. We see it, and Bucharest sees it. It gets better after about a year. But early on, it's like the brain is not cooking on all four burners as much. And there's an example. This is the alpha frequency, and the red is the post-institutionalized kids, and the green are the non-adopted kids born and raised in their families. These kids are 18 months. They were adopted 14 to 15 months of age. So this is 3 months post-adoption. And you can see that they're just not, and it's across the brain. Don't trust the frontal things. They kept falling off. I don't trust those measures in the front. But generally across the brain is not activated as rapidly. And as I said, it goes away. But what we pick up at 18 months predicts, this is Amanda Trullo's work, poor performance on inhibitory control tasks at 3, and more indiscriminate friendliness behavior at 3. And in Bucharest, their study is Katie McLaughlin's work, more ADHD symptoms at 5. So we're getting a pattern here that something is going on, probably with the development of the prefrontal cortex in the anterior cingulate. We've done structural imaging, so have they in Bucharest. We see very similar things. This is work from my work with Katie Thomas. Kids are 12 and 13 years of age. This was part of an NIMH center that B.J. Casey directed, and I'll be showing you some other data from that in a minute. We looked at brain volume, and we have functional measures, but right now, and DTI and everything under the sun, but what we have right now that's actually gotten out in print is evidence on the structural. And what you're seeing is correcting for brain volume. We divided the kids, these are all from orphanages. At 12 months, they were adopted by 12 months or over 12 months to 5. The clear are Minnesota kids, born and raised in their upper middle class families. And the frontal lobes are smaller. And there's no dose response here for the PFC, which was worrisome to me. It may also reflect prenatal as well as postnatal then. But also, what's happening in the prefrontal cortex by 12 months? I mean, isn't that a late developing structure? We don't even have to worry about it till adolescence. Turns out that ain't true. And we know it for 2 reasons. One, I love Dagus. I think they're very, very cute. They have a biparental care model. Professor Katarina Brown has been studying them. What's cool is you can take the dad away. He does all the social care. He's the TLC guy. The mom just feeds. She's functional. And in that model, if you take the dad away, mom does not step up. Okay, so basically the animals are fed, but they're not cuddle, love stimulated. And when you look at their developing brain, this is early, where you see it is really altered pathways in the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate. The prefrontal cortex is extremely sensitive to early experiences. And this is a wonderful paper by Brian Kolb, who has documented this, is doing different things, but it is active early and it is sensitive early. And we have a paper by Amanda Hodel, should be coming out soon, looking at this in humans. So prefrontal cortex, sensitive to experience early on. No surprise that we're seeing pre-FC things in kids who are adopted by age 2 out of orphanages. No surprise at all. And that brings me to peer and peer relations. Because one of the things that I think we all know is kids who have developmental disabilities that influence prefrontal functioning have lots of problems with peers. They're oftentimes rejected by peers. They have struggled to play with peers. Many parents pull them out of school because the kid's so miserable because they're being treated so badly. There's something about a prefrontal cortex that's sort of needed if you're going to negotiate the complexity of a peer landscape. And in fact, part of the argument has been, why is our prefrontal cortex so beautiful and big and robust? Is we live in social groups that are complicated, and we need that. It's not about algebra, it's about social network complexity. So we've been interested in what goes on with peers. We also think that some of what's happening in adolescence and adulthood is that you're struggling to be able to make those really critical friendship relationships. We looked at peer problems for kids in kindergarten as part of the TIFS work. We scored them on numerous dimensions, including quality of peer interactions. We had parent and teacher reports on peer competence and functioning, and what we saw is what we expected, except for those foster care kids. The foster care kids from adopted internationally also seem to have difficulty with peer functioning. Okay, that's kindergarten. B.J. Casey's study was a study of BDNF and why the variant in that gene was important for everything under the sun. When she asked me to sign on to that study, she told me I get to image about 300 kids from orphanages. I said, I don't care what you're studying, I want to do that. So, hello, we signed on to be part of that center. To get BDNF is not, one third, no. So to get equal groups, we sent the saliva kits out and got the data back, and then we would select the kids to come in based on their genotype. But that meant I was sending saliva kits out to hundreds of post-institutionalized kids. Great, I wasn't just going to do that. I sent them the HBQ as well. I wanted to know their behavior. So I have data from that study. We had data on around 400 or so post-institutionalized kids, 8 to 12 years of age. I didn't have any non-adopted kids in that sample, so I contacted Marilyn Essex at Wisconsin. She, of course, developed the HBQ, and she had lots of these data on her sample of kids in the Wisconsin Family and Work Study. And we worked together, and we did an analysis, and what we saw was that these kids, especially the boys, more so than the girls at 8 to 12 years of age, were victimized by their peers. And it was true both for the early adopted under 12 months and the late adopted. The girls, not so much. It was true both for physically victimized, overtly, and relational aggression. So similar. And if I showed you peer acceptance, it would be the opposite of this. So they're not being accepted. And this mediates depressive symptoms, okay, as one might expect. Okay, why? Now, most victimized kids are partly victimized because they're aggressive. But when we looked at aggression in this sample, the parents were saying, oh, no, they're not. They're less aggressive than the typical. And I'm going, yeah, right. So we also looked at it in another sample of kids and had the kids report to us on their behavior. And what we found, 211 kids, we had PI, FC, and NA. We had parent and child HBQ. We looked at overt aggression. Boys more than girls, no surprise, but no difference in aggression among the PI, FC, and NA. It's not an aggressive signature that's getting them victimized. Something else. That's the measure of overt aggression. So now I go back to my kindergarten data, the TIFS stuff, and I say, okay, I have teacher reports of attention problems. I know from my earlier work that hypocortisolism is predicting that. How does that fit in to whether peers don't like them? And the answer is, actually for both the PI and the FC kids, is that, yeah, I got peer problems, but if I feed in hypocortisolism, ADHD symptoms, and peer problems, then I have no link between groups. So it looks like, and I wish I had executive functions more broadly, but one thing it looks like is early adversity, something is going crazy with the HPA axis. It may be a cause or simply a marker that's pointing me towards problems with attention and prefrontal function development, and that seems to be the thing that may be feeding into these kids' challenges with peers. Now, we have followed up because I have a student, Carrie De Pasquale. She worked with Mary Dozier, came to me for grad school. She's fearless. Didn't matter she had no money. Didn't matter we had no money for it. She followed these kids up when they were 8 to 10 to look at peer relations. Bake sale and car wash funding, basically. She brought them to the laboratory. She paired them with partners from our research registry in the Institute. These are typically developing kids. And the target kid was always from TIFS, either the PI or NA. She didn't have, she had no money, so she couldn't do the foster care kids. She developed a series of tasks they did. One of them was, they did bingo, which was easy peasy. They did this etch-a-guess task, where each of you has a knob and you have to make something, and it takes real cooperation. And then after that, where they really would learn a lot about each other, they played Simon, which is a competitive task. We were interested in whether their affect on Simon would be attuned to affect on the Etch-a-Sketch. And what we found is that was absolutely true for our non-adopted kids playing with other non-adopted kids. And there was no relation for our PI kids. It was like they were being as nice or not nice. There was not a difference in their behavior or their treatment of the other kid, but somehow kids were not able to mesh with them as well. And here's those data, so you sort of see that line that goes up there. That's my non-adopted kids playing with prediction from Etch-a-Sketch to peer. And it's basically flat for my PI kids. So there's something, they're just not attuning. And the cortisol response of the non-adopted, of the target child, the comparison kid wasn't predicted by the PI's behavior, but it was for my non-adopted kids. So there's something we're not picking up about what's happening in those relationships, which is somehow not allowing typically developing kids to sort of attune themselves to what's going on with my PI kids. Something we're not seeing. We're really interested. It may be timing. It may be other kinds of subtleties that are really challenging the typically developing kids. In the last few moments, I know I'm talking really fast, I want to talk to you about this game that we tried with these kids. So this is another group of kids. It's actually from the B.J. Casey study, smaller group that we actually brought in for imaging. And we've been thinking about this indiscriminate friendly behavior, right? This disorder of social engagement. And these kids go up to anybody. They're friendly with anybody. They're willing to walk off with any stranger who says, I've got a dog around the corner that needs your help. I mean, they seem like overly trusting, right? So what would we see if we actually examined trust in these kids? So we used a variant of Baumgartner's task, which you may or may not know of, but basically you're given coins, you're playing against somebody else. You can either give them all your coins and then they can decide how much to give back, or you can keep your coins. And basically, if they're trustworthy, both of you will make more money. If they keep it, you're in deep doo-doo, okay? And so we set it up. They really believed they were playing against kids. We had all this cool, calling things up on a computer and pictures of kids and kids signing in and all the rest of that. And they reported they believed us, which may be the measure, actually, we should look at. But so did the non-adopted kids. And then we also had them play a lottery game, where it's the same idea, but they were playing against a lottery, a non-social thing. There were trials here and a bunch of, and every time they played the game, it was a different kid. So they're not learning about a specific kid, they're learning about kids, okay? And then there was this period of time where they got no feedback. Then there was a period of time where they got feedback that most of the kids they were playing with were trustworthy, and then 2 blocks where they weren't trustworthy, right? And the kids are 12 and 13 years of age. We saw some interesting patterns over time. Basically, your kids are in trouble, so are mine, if they're not adopted from conditions of harshness, because they continue to believe that people are trustworthy way after they should not believe it, right? I'm like, oh, this must be an anomaly because people are nice, right? But what we saw for the PI kids, and we split them again at 12 months of age, was that if they were adopted under 12 months, they acted very much like our non-adopted kids. And what's interesting is they trusted peers more than they trusted the lottery. But if they were adopted over 12 months of age, From the get-go, they trusted the lottery more than peers. And the minute people were untrustworthy, went in the can. So they're not gullible. They learned not to trust people, which may also feed into issues that they're having. Not only can I not get my act together with you, but if you do anything that I may be likely to turn on you and not believe you're not my friend. So I wanted to give us a little time for questions, which is why I went like really fast. And your question would be, could you repeat that, please? But what we've basically seen is that long-term correlates of early adversity of this type follow even when you get them out of there and put them in really some of the best. And I haven't shown you the parent data, but we've scored parent behavior. Most of you would be happy to have these parents. They're sensitive, they're generally responsive, not all of them, but they're like us, right? The kids, children in these supportive homes, most are not displaying clinical levels of internalizing or externalizing, at least as kids. They have a load of support. That changes a bit in adolescence. The big signals we see are disorders of social engagement for some of them. That does seem to be predictive of other problems. Seems to be related to challenges with executive function, though not wholly overlapping, but executive function challenges are definitely there. It's the biggest signal we've got. And there's something off about peer relations, which may be a reflection of these other problems, making it difficult for them to really negotiate a peer landscape, perhaps especially if they're boys. I don't know, the girls. Actually, what I really think it is in adolescence for the girls is adolescence for girls is awful, I don't care what. And when you're a 12 and 13-year-old girl, I mean, things are not going right. Seriously, I mean, we're doing stress interviews, and we're just reminding us of why we don't want to be 12 and 13-year-old girls anymore. Right. So I think actually that may be the issue more than with boys. It's more straightforward. And we think that some of these things just set the stage for the emotional problems and challenges that many of these kids experience in adolescence and later in life. And with that, I want to thank 1 million people who have helped with this research and with my thinking and so forth and so on. And we have time for questions. Yes.
That was really a wonderful summary and just exciting to hear you talk. Just your thoughts as times change, as you've looked at this for a while, and around social engagement for kids. You know, we're all hot now on the advances of technology and kids not engaging in the same way they once did. So kids aren't clinically symptomatic in the home, but they're having these social problems. Do you think about the contributions of kids not having the experiences of learning social interactions in the same way we did?
Okay, so you're asking the poor developmental psychologist. Always good to get this question about screen time and everything else. I don't know. I mean, it's the world that we're going to live in. So thank heavens children are growing up in the world they're going to live in and are getting skilled at dealing with it, is one way to think about it. The bigger concern I think all of us have is not your kid who's 9, 10, 11, 12 learning to read subtle cues and emojis that come from blah, 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 right? And dying because, you know, so-and-so hasn't followed whatever they put up on Instagram. Was that still last year? I don't know. Is that, but the bigger issue we have is I'm concerned about is parents of babies who are on their screen instead of on FOSS. And that, if I could, you know, take care of that problem, I think the rest, you know, we worried about television. You know, people made their careers out of studying the terrible impact of television. Well, it wasn't great, but most kids survive it, right? And then computer games was you know. So I think we're going to learn to adapt to this as long as we can do the fundamental things that have to be done early in life with kids to help them connect with human beings. So that worries me more. But also, of course, going to camps where they take your phone away is a great plan. Yeah.
Thanks.
We see a lot of kids who, although not growing up in orphanages, grow up in very deprived, neglected, or traumatic homes, and then we deal with them therapeutically in better foster homes or adopted homes. And I imagine we'll get into interventions later in the week's discussion. But when these kids come to our clinical attention, very often the parents will be part of a RAD group, and there's a reification
Oh,
of
there
rad,
is.
so that there's both this overgeneralized attribution of, well, of course she does that because she has rad, but there's also some implication of its immutability and
Yep.
its being destiny. Could you say something about how you talk to parents of kids who are having disorders of attachment and social engagement post-adoption, and what we should be telling them about the chances of being able to ameliorate it?
Bob, you just may want to say what RAD is.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Oh,
reactive
disorder,
attachment
of which now
disorder.
there is only the inhibited type,
Right.
by the way. Yeah, I'm not a clinician, so I get out of most of this question.
Okay.
But what I have found talking to parents, I mean, they've read all of this stuff,
Mhm.
right? They see the behavior and they think their kid is not attached to them. And it's a great relief to them to know that, no, this child is hormone attached. See how when, you know, he's looking back to you? Yes, this is a different thing. This is about strangers. This is about what you need to do to help this child know that you shouldn't go off with strangers and do these things. I'm not convinced that it has anything to do with peers. In fact, the kids, and I didn't show you this, I analyzed it yesterday because I knew somebody would ask me a question. And I called Jamie Lawler, who had done I said, you've got another paper here. Because what we saw with the kids who had DSED is when we look at parent report, at least, these kids actually are socially withdrawn and behaviorally inhibited around peers. So it's like this DSED thing is about grown-ups, because that's what you would see in the orphanages, mama, 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 right? And may not be about other kids. So that doesn't answer your question. What would I tell parents? Well, first of all, they're feeling guilty, so they're happy to have a label, right? And it may not be an attachment disorder, but something clearly is going on. So let's figure out what it is and what we can do to help. I think some of the worst cases probably come from fetal alcohol syndrome kids, or just, you know, the exposure kids, because those are the ones that we see that don't, you know, develop. I mean, they're a big challenge. Otherwise, we've just got kids who, you know, are going to need an executive secretary for most of their lives because the prefrontal cortex here, they really can't plan. But they're not necessarily having that hostile kind of response that we sometimes see with kids with FASD. Yeah.
First of all, a comment and then a question. The comment, it is really helpful and instructive to hear you weave together your...
It's
We-
really, I'm brilliant. He loves listening to me.
Yeah. Weave together the flow of your curiosity across your career, because with all the younger researchers here, they think they've got to get it all and then hold on tight. And what you've embraced are the things you haven't understood.
Oh yeah, that's the most,
And-
if you're finally finding what you predicted, you're not, it's like sailing. If you don't capsize, you
right.
haven't tried hard enough.
And you're so not done. That's what I
So
love.
not done.
The other question, what have you, your work has often been appropriated by people who are sort of outside the usual suspects to talk about it's either too late, why bother, or it's let's get busy early and throw our resources where it matters. Tell us how that has affected you and how it's affected your focus on policy.
Sure. So my focus on policy has been to convince people we need to get in there early. But my phrase is, like, none of us with our kids would pack their bags and put them on a street corner at age 5 and say, you're done. Right? We're done. We've done it all. You don't need any more. I mean, we start early and keep going if we want to have a successful society. But, I mean, I'm absolutely not with the crew that, you know, there's nothing you can do once these kids are 3 and they're coming up and they're toast. I mean, that's not true. We learn to live with who we are. And as good parents, we learn to help our kids live with who they are. And the issues that I see with these kids are oftentimes within the realm of, you know, what you might find in a family, because Uncle Joe actually had absolutely no prefrontal function either. So it's figuring out, right, good parenting is helping your kids learn the skills so that they can be successful with who they are. And that's what we need to do as a society for kids who have struggled early, is helping. And then getting the roadblocks out of their way. Structural racism, all those things, right? It's not just about the kids, it's about the society we create. Yeah. Do we have one more?
So thank you again for coming to Yale, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentations later in the week. And this may be a question you'll be addressing later on. Have you been looking at the epigenetic signatures? We're actually in the process of trying to find someone to help us with our epigenetic work. Is that
Okay.
anything that you've actually looked at?
I did once, I stuck my toe in,